And we are going to focus on the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union in the 1970s, you wouldn't have guessed was going to collapse. When it came to the Cold War, they were doing much better than we were. They were outmaneuvering us in almost every way possible. Communism was spreading. Containment looked like it wasn't working. You saw in Vietnam, after the Vietnam War had ended, Ho Chi Minh took the rest of Vietnam and they took control there. The USSR economy was doing great, and things were looking really good for them. Now, as we get into 1979 and into the 80s, things are going to change. Soviet involvement in Afghanistan, which we've learned about already, is going to be one thing that's going to be real detrimental to the USSR. During this video, you're going to hear me talk a lot about economic impact. And ultimately, at the end of the day, even though we're measuring ideas of communist and capitalism in the USSR, the measuring stick is the economy. And when the USSR economy crumbles, so will the USSR. Now, we're relating that to their ideas as to being the reason they fell, but ultimately, when we look at who wins this, it's because of who has the better economy when things are all said and done. And Afghanistan was one of those reasons or areas where the USSR economy really took a hit. It was a very expensive endeavor, which resulted in very little gain. They did not gain a communist ally. They did not gain a ton of resources. That war in Afghanistan that they fought ended up being essentially for nothing, and it cost a lot of money. Costing a lot of money is going to be a theme here. Additionally, we will see a disaster, it was not natural, that occurred in a nuclear power plant. I'm referring to the Chernobyl explosion of 1986. It's estimated that this cleanup costs alone $235 billion. The cleanup, along with everything else that went along with Chernobyl, really showed the flaws that existed in the Soviet Union. There's an awesome HBO series, it's just called Chernobyl, that I recommend totally for you guys to watch during this quarantine. I don't know if it will be a ton of relevant social studies content to the regions, but it's a very, very interesting look into history and to the impacts that this incident had in the Soviet Union and that just kind of really reflected the problems that existed there. And some of those problems at the time is another cause of the Soviet Union collapse, and that's political instability. At this time, after Brezhnev loses his role, he dies, passes away, and they pass on that torch, you go through a 4-year period where you're going to have 3 different Soviet leaders. And within those Soviet leaders, you're going to have a lot of corruption, which leads to political instability. And just changing leaders creates political instability. Well, Chernobyl really exposes what a nation who censors everything, it exposes the problems that exist with a nation who censors everything. You will see if you watch that documentary, or I shouldn't call it a documentary, it's a docu-series, it's based on a real event. If you watch that, you will see how the fact that they cover things up leads to them having a lot of problems, economic in particular, but lives and radiation and all these issues that come with that, because you have people who are political heads, not people who are doctors, researchers, scientists making the calls. You're going to end up with a lot of problems. And because they can't speak out, because they're censored, you can't expose the problems that are going on in the government. And you really see that happen in this video. So again, it's cool. But ultimately, this Chernobyl incident will be a major, major cause of the Soviet Union collapse. So at the end of those 3 leaders I talk about comes a guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. And in my classroom, I really wish I brought it home with me, I have a Gorby doll hanging in my room or on a shelf in my room. And Gorbachev is one of the more, I don't know if popular at the time was the right term, but in the U.S., he's one of the more popular Soviet leaders because of the changes he makes. The changes he makes ultimately do two things. They prove that, well, the USSR had some success. Ultimately, you can't be a total communist nation to succeed. And he does this with a couple policies that he institutes. One is glasnost. Glasnost translates to openness. And the openness here is in the freedom of speech that hadn't existed because of the censorship within the Soviet Union. For the first time now, people in the press, people in everyday life can expose or share their thoughts on the Soviet government. What are the problems we see? What needs to be fixed? What issues do we have? And by exposing or allowing people to expose this corruption, two things are going to happen. One, people are going to gain a freedom. Two, it's going to really break down the system that exists. It's going to cause Mikhail Gorbachev and the communist leaders in power to ultimately become dissolved by 1990. The Soviet Union will collapse and die totally in 1991, and it'll be gone. The other policy that Gorbachev puts into place is called perestroika. Perestroika is an economic policy, and this is going to allow for, you guessed it, limited capitalism. It's going to give people the opportunity to have private businesses in a limited capacity. The major industries will still be controlled by the government, but ultimately, this is, like I said, is proof that the U.S. is kind of winning the Cold War because you are using U.S. ideologies to try and fix your crumbling economy. And the other thing that's contributing to this economy crumbling is the Soviet Union was unable to keep up with the arms race, partially because our president at the time in the 80s, Ronald Reagan, instituted a program called Star Wars, or it was actually called the Strategic Defense Initiative. But basically, he's going to hike up military spending in the U.S. and say, come on, USSR, come compete with us. I dare you. And ultimately, that's going to drain their economy. The other thing that's going to hurt their economy is, in a capitalist society, you have the production of consumer goods. So I think about this because John Green made a video talking about lack of consumer goods, and he shared that a bouncy ball is the reason the USSR lost the Cold War. And my daughter and I just made a bouncy ball yesterday, and actually I shouldn't give myself credit. My wife and my daughter made a bouncy ball yesterday. And a bouncy ball is something you wouldn't see produced in the Soviet Union. But it's something that an American will spend money on. I remember when I was a kid, we used to put the quarter in the machine, you used to twist it, bouncy ball would come out, and boom, I'm causing havoc in my house and disrupting my parents for an hour until I lost it or it broke. And with a bouncy ball, that's a consumer good. It's something that's a want, not a need. You don't need a bouncy ball. And one of the nice things with a bouncy ball, though, is it gets money flowing. And ultimately, if money is exchanging hands in an economy, the economy is going to prosper. It's going to do well. The Soviet Union's not developing things that are wants. They're not developing many things that are consumer goods that's just going to get money exchanging hands. So ultimately what I'm trying to say here is a consumer good and the development of them is going to help an economy. And in a capitalist economy, you're going to see way more consumer goods than you will see in a communist or command-style economy. So continuing here with Gorbachev, he is going to install perestroika because he wants the development of more consumer goods. He wants more private enterprise. He's trying to revitalize the economy. Ultimately, he fails. People are going to be happy with some of the newfound freedoms. The people are going to be happy with the new options that are available to them. But the true communist diehards that exist in the Soviet Union are going to blame Gorbachev for the failure of the Soviet Union and his policies. Truth be told, it was likely the Soviet Union was on its way out, no matter what was going to happen. And you really saw this with nationalist movements, satellite nations, and different ethnic groups that were within the Soviet Union are going to begin to demand their freedom. They're going to want to have their independence. So as this happens and more nations push, Gorbachev makes the call that we're not going to use military force to stop them. We will try and convince them otherwise to not leave the Soviet Union, but we're not going to use military force. And the use of military force was something Brezhnev developed in what's called the Brezhnev Doctrine, where we are going to stop nations from leaving us through the use of military force. And this doctrine goes away under Gorbachev. The thing that really signals the end of the Cold War, not necessarily the Soviet Union, is the fall of the Berlin Wall. 1987, Ronald Reagan gives a speech. Mr. Gorbachev, please tear down this wall. In 1989, the people come and tear it down, and it's a pretty monumental event. You'll see in the next in the activity we're going to do, you get a look at the Berlin Wall and what it was supposed to do and what it did and what it represented. So that'll give you a little more there. But with the Berlin Wall down, you now have to reunite Germany. You have a part that's been democratic for a long time and a side that's been communist for a long time. And trying to mesh those two things together and make it work is going to be troublesome. It will eventually get there, but it will take a long time and a lot of struggles that Germany had to go through there. So ultimately, all those factors combined, when you look at the lack of consumer goods, Glasnost and Perestroika by Mikhail Gorbachev, you look at the costs of Afghanistan, the costs of Chernobyl, the political instability, these are the major factors that will cause or lead to the fall of the Soviet Union. We'll see what comes next. We'll do it in a real condensed format. But ultimately, the fall of the Soviet Union is a big deal. That's why I've been talking for 13 minutes and 33 seconds about it. So this video is a little longer than I wanted it to go, but hopefully it gets those points home of what you need and helps you understand why the Soviet Union fell.